So good afternoon, I should say. I was almost said good morning there, but good afternoon, Frankston City. I hope you're enjoying the wonderful weather out there. I've been fortunate enough to get down to Foot Street today to visit one of my favourite local cafes. Today we are talking about rates and finance as part of our Tuesday, Friday policy discussions. Unfortunately, Sue Baker's unable to join us today because she's got a prior engagement, but she'll be back with us on Sunday. I'm also pleased to welcome in Alan Middleton, who is a candidate in the North West Ward. You may have met him on Wednesday night when he was interviewed with Glenn Cooper and myself and Sue Baker. And also pleased to have back Brad Hill and Peter Malone, who are running in the South Ward. As I've said before, reaching out to candidates across the city to give them the opportunity to come and talk to us and talk with you about your concerns in different policy areas, and then the Sunday conversations are far more relaxed. I did also want to flag just quickly the sad news that I received last night that a candidate who was going to be working with us on the Fresh Start for Frankston ticket has withdrawn. I'll let her make her own comments about that, but I think what it speaks to is many of the challenges we've got around the toxic culture of politics in Frankston Council, and really reinforces to me why we need a fresh start. Alan, I gave Brad the opportunity to sort of talk about himself for a couple of minutes when he first started joining these conversations, and I'd like to extend the same courtesy to you, and then we'll get into the discussion around rates and finance. And just to flag, there are a couple of comments that came through ahead of the broadcast as well. But Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, and hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here today. For a start, I'm sorry to hear that you've had somebody drop out, and you mentioning some kind of toxicity. Well, I guess that's what we really want to try and put to a stop. I think Frankston deserves better. Obviously, I've been around for a bit, and as a result of, the more you've been around, the more you end up getting involved in. So it becomes long and boring, but I've had a fantastic time in taking opportunities that have led me into some really varied jobs and places, always within Australia, but I've travelled to every state and done quite a lot of work. In fact, over 20 years worth of exposure to far north Australia, right across from far north Queensland, Weipa, Torres Strait into Arnhem Land and across the Kimberley, working in community organisations, local government and the private sector on economic development and policy and local government. But I've also had the opportunity to work within Victoria across a broad range as well, and that includes over in Western Victoria, the Bull Oak Shire, Witchy-Proof and Donald, and so seeing how regional Australia and local government councils and their stakeholders interact. And I must say that the environment across Australia is very similar across the board. So if we talk about Queensland for a moment, which is where I certainly have been most recently for about 12 years, and have returned back to Melbourne and Frankston, the original home for me and Janet, some 2 years ago. I can say that there are extraordinary governance problems. So Queensland, Ipswich Council, so many councils going into administration, so many councils having governance issues, so many councils having toxic, dominant 2 or 3 players with dominant senior personnel across council, and suddenly, the planning codes are used to favour the few or to overwhelm the majority being small business, who simply cannot afford to take their life savings and put them into some wasteful defence from council. 90% of the time, if not more, If a person does consider that they should stand up and fight and take the matter to a planning court, some, $200,000 of personal funds later and a wasteful couple of years, more often than not they win. And I see that that's been the situation with Frankston repeatedly. And I see it happening at Tyab at the moment, where repeatedly the Tyab airport issue, for example, has gone to the planning court now, amongst other attempted, prior to that, of course, there's many attempted mediation meetings. And throughout the whole, council has been told to cease and desist by the planning court most recently. And their result was, within 7 days, to lodge a whole new application along the same lines, a repeated, now the devil's in the detail, but I can say this, I've got experience of having to battle council because of being the managing director and involved as a stakeholder, unit holder in a significant airport in Townsville. And for the last 8 years, we've simply been spending time and money on issues from council, ranging from wanting to pull our hangar down, which didn't succeed, through to the most current one just last week, a renewed effort to stop us using the driveway to the property, the main driveway to our significant airport. It's been there since the airport was approved in 1990. And suddenly the council has decided, let's have a go at them and stop them using the drive. Well, the driveway is 80 metres long. It's nothing. We can move it. But why would you want to do that? And why is this the seeming culture of councils? So that's my sort of experience.
Yeah. And I think, Alan, that that's the kind of experience that we're currently lacking at Frankston Council. But let's not talk too much about the challenges we've got with the current council. Let's talk about a future council, and let's talk about the challenges of rates and finance. Everyone will have gotten their rates notice in the last week or two. Most people will have noticed that their rates will have gone up. I've certainly been bombarded with questions from the public about, well, what am I getting more for this? People are concerned about COVID recovery. People are concerned about wastage in terms of spending council funds, which aren't really council funds. They're our funds as ratepayers and residents. And we need to always remember that, and principles of good stewardship around the use of funds. Brad, I'm going to start with you, perhaps, if I can, because you've been there before, and you've seen it from the inside. What's your thoughts around the current approach to both rates and finance at council?
I guess there's a few things here. Firstly, what a lot of people don't realise is that the collection of rates and the use of property values in determining your rates is a mandate in legislation from the state government. The council doesn't control how all that is worked out. Rates is always contentious because, certainly in my case, I think rates would have to be the biggest expense I have that arrives in my letterbox every year, far beyond my rego bill, my other cost that arrives in one hit, and it's $2,500–3,000 for most of us, and everyone goes, "What the hell is this exactly?" Mm-hmm. And everyone wants to pay less rates, and look, to cut a long story short, I think it's a question of making sure that our rates are spent appropriately. There's a lot of instances where it isn't appropriate, and that's what makes people upset. And I think you need councillors around the table with some common sense to make sure it is spent appropriately. The devil in the detail is, when we talk about reducing rates, If you want to reduce the council's income, you need to reduce their spend. Everyone has their own idea on what waste is. And the problem is you've got 9 councillors around a table trying to agree on what's wasteful and what's not. I might, for example, be interested in sporting clubs. Other councillors will be more interested in aged care or capital works projects, roadworks, whatever it is, and trying to have a consensus around where we cut spending is tricky. Usually when we talk about waste, I mean, we've had, you know, $200,000 for a monitor appointed to the council to try to bring their behaviour under control. We've had $60,000 on a shower for the homeless. It's one shower that's only used for 2 hours a week. We've got, you know, some steel mesh on the wall of the council for $55,000 there to grow a vine on. And this is terrific stuff to throw around as examples of waste, but it's only a very small fraction of the budget, you know, which is something like $150 million or thereabouts. And that's the hard part. If you really want to reduce rates, even if you wanted to reduce rates by 1%, you have to find about $800,000 or $900,000 in savings, which is a code word for cuts, right? So, you know, that's the reality when you're in council on the ground. How do we actually address this? Really easy to make the statement, hard to actually reduce the expenditure.
Yeah,
but it can be done.
Yeah, and look, I think that's the real challenge. Is there is that balance between council income and the ability to spend. I'm also conscious that council has made significant surpluses for certainly the last 3 years. Holds a significant amount of money in reserves, and I know that some of those reserves have to be held there for statutory reasons and for borrowing reasons as well. But the signal that it's sending to the residents in Frankston is that we're going to keep taking your money and banking it. And there's a real issue then around how that's communicated. The other thing we've got is very different this year compared to any other year, is we're now living in a COVID environment where households and businesses are struggling, and any relief is welcome. Peter, what are your thoughts on this before we invite Alan in?
Yeah, okay. Look, it's management of budgets is a big deal. How you manage the budget, looking for waste, yes. I appreciate what Brad said about, yeah, you can look at these things which do appear like wastage, and they are, and they're overspent, and how did that happen? You know, I know what Brad's saying, and I know that's the case. It's small change in the bigger picture, but it's that small change. We should be showing an example. We shouldn't be doing those wasteful things. The other thing is that, yes, really, particularly in these times, there was a book a long time ago called Economics as If People Matter, and that's where I am. Economics as if people matter. So I take in what you said, Stephen, because I think the same way. We, of course, I mean, this is not something, we're not deciding a budget right here and now, but we're just talking generally. Looking at, you know, traditional economics, what's done. It's better that people suffer and you have more money in the bank. No, it's not. It's better that you revitalise Frankston. You possibly go into reserves to the extent that you can. You've got to be careful doing this. I absolutely agree. But honestly, it's economics as if people matter, and as if revitalisation of the business sector matters. This is a book that I've read recently. You probably can't, you can possibly just see it a bit when it's
called The Deficit Myth.
The Deficit Myth. Now, I fully know that is really an economics thing for federal parliament. It's not even for state, you know, for states. The deficit myth is, yeah, you can run a deficit. Now, local council is more like a household budget, only hugely bigger. You do have to balance books, etc. So it doesn't come into that. But it just illustrates how we need to think about this really carefully and not just sort of zip off to traditional economics as we come out of this extraordinary COVID cloud. And I'll stop there because, as you say, I think Alan does know a bit about economics and finances, so it'd be very interesting to hear from him.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll come to you in a second, Alan, if you're ready to unmute yourself. But the one of the questions that we've had from our online viewers was around the recent fraud case as well. So I was wondering if you could touch on the issue of rates and finance, but also what does it mean when you've got a blowout of almost $500,000 in fraud? What does that tell you about the level of oversight or governance or stewardship of funds, particularly given your background in sort of forensic financial investigations?
Thanks, Stephen. Peter, I'm really pleased to see that you're reading some modern monetary theory and broadening your one's general horizons on basic economics 101. Now, to most people, and I'd just like to emphasize, it's only until you've got a PhD in economics that anybody listens to you, and yet all you want to tell them about is economics 101 that people got in first year, or indeed high school. So there's a couple of things that economists love to do. My background is in economics, finance, I'm a fellow CPA, amongst other things, including Master of Laws and so on. That's simply because, as I say, I've been around a while and I've had an interest in reading non-fiction rather than fiction, so which is probably more telling of a personality conflict and defect than anything else. Nonetheless, it then means that I can sort of look at something and make a reasonable set of views about it. And the starting point always is, let's get some assumptions underway that we all agree with. And the first question to be asked is, if we're going to start multiplying at high school level analysis as a beginning, let's say how many households, or that is to say ratepayers, are there that are affected by council? That is, how many households contribute rates, households and businesses, how many in just raw number contribute rates to the coffers of Frankston Council? Anybody know that?
Oh, from memory, it's around about 100,000.
100,000 household. And I think we've got a population of all ages, of course, but an entire population of around, is it 140?
That's about right.
Yep. And so you multiply that by an average of, say, 3,000 for a house and, how much for a business? Well, averages can be skewed, but council's very good at breaking down these numbers so that we can get an idea of the percentage contribution from households at an average of, say, $3,000 a year compared to an average contribution of businesses, large and small, as a conglomerate group to make up these balances. And from there, council then applies some gymnastics around some types of businesses get discounts, other types of businesses actually get surcharges, and on property values across the entire local government area, there are some differences in valuation. And that is where the whole thing becomes quite a headache. And you think to yourself, this is so complex, I can't, it comes back to the bureaucracy and the technocrats to make these calculations and to provide more or less sensitivity analysis projections to councillors to try and make decisions about forward-looking rates and fees decisions. Yeah, correct?
Yeah.
Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think so. And just, I think there's this kind of issue of stewardship, and that speaks also to how council manages itself and how councillors behave. If you look at things that are kind of out of budget expenditure, let's take notices of motion, for example. I saw a piece of paper, it must have been a couple of months ago, that calculated that the costs of notices of motion, so those out of cycle budget decisions, which for things like, for example, chicken wire and vines, were totaling up to something like $1.6 million. So it's not even thought through as expenditure in a manner that would reflect good stewardship, which I find quite extraordinary. Brad, any reflections on that, and how we might, in a new council, be able to rein that in a bit?
What I've noticed from, because I've been watching the council ordinary meetings now for quite some time, and I've been, ever since I was in the council, taking more of an interest in those notices of motions and the budgets. And, generally if councillors want a project to happen, or a new playground or whatever it is, they make submissions into the budget process, and it ends up in the document which they vote on, and then away you go. And then you'll get some councillors who, after that is complete, they'll start raising a motion. Our community needs this. Let's have, let's have this playground. Let's upgrade that sporting club. Let's do this. And the budget process isn't there, right? They're trying to commit to expenditure, which isn't in the budget. And although we'll have a lot of motions calling for all of these projects to be added into the budget next year, and look, to be honest, it's a couple of things. It's grandstanding. They raise motions for the sake of having motions, to make it visible. They're, incurring spend and trying to have a budget, item outside of the process. We've talked about how much it is for a typical house, and it is about $3,000, I think, roughly. That wouldn't be too far wrong. When, a councillor adds items into the budget outside the process, or they call for a report on this, or, a consultant to be engaged to give them a document or whatever it is, every time you spend that $3,000, that's a worker, that's a pensioner who struggled to cobble that together, that's being, spent willy-nilly by some councillors as if it's monopoly money.
Yeah.
We have people in Frankston that really struggle to pay their rates. We have people in Frankston that are on very low incomes, struggling to pay for their electricity, for their heating and whatever. And, yes, some of these things are not huge in the scale of things, but think about it in terms of the number of those low income households, that the money that, whose money you're actually proposing to spend. And that's what's lost here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's also part of that as well is that there are certain types of business as well within Frankston City and the community more broadly that operate on very, very tight margins. We know, for example, the hospitality trade, it can be a highly variable in terms of profitability, and each one of those costs has an impact as well. Peter, some of your reflections around this challenge that we need to wrestle with and kind of responsible stewardship.
Yeah. Look, I'll listen to what Brad has said, and yeah, it's interesting. I think, to me, in my mind, just working on the board down there at Chisholm and the way it operates, board chairman, being an equivalent of the mayor, I guess. Chairing the meetings, if I'm correct, and the board directors being the councillors. Now, when we talk about, there's papers that come out and there's an agenda. Now, when we're talking about things down there, when you can bring things up, I suppose, but it really, it the whole thing is determined by the type and calibre of councillors that you have and the control exercised by a mayor who's chairing the meeting. Now, bringing up all sorts of extraneous other things like, no, I don't think so. I think we need a swing or a this or that, whatever, wherever. If this hasn't come up as part of the plan beforehand, I'm a bit surprised that these things, I'm not surprised, I suppose I shouldn't say that, but I don't think it's right that these things out of left of centre can come up willy-nilly during a council meeting, and people can do notices of not during the meeting, but what is it, other times they do notices of motions and...
Well, usually it's advance notice, but they can raise them as an urgent item during the meeting.
Okay, and thanks for that. And I guess it's up to the mayor chairing the meeting whether it's allowed or not, or whether it's considered. I think there's probably a lot of it needs to be tighter meetings, I think, and better controlled. And that, of course, also depends on who the councillors are as well, and how strictly they'll sort of stick to the rules and be reasonable. So that's a problem that can only be saved once again with a, that's our mantra, I know, but it is a fresh start. You just need reasonable people there to deal reasonably.
Thank you, Peter. Alan, I'm going to come to you. Just reflecting on Peter's comments there, it sounds to me it's almost like a kind of question of ethics and values being applied to financial management, and how it is that we govern a city like Frankston in a way that makes sure that we are considering the value of every single dollar that goes through. Picking up on Brad's point around, the balance between revenue and expenditure and the impact that then has on people. But my view is that we're in an incredibly unusual time, that a short-term hit on revenue for the wider benefit of the community might be in order as part of COVID recovery. Just want to pick up on your thoughts there, Alan, particularly given that you've been involved in different boards and different kinds of organisations over the years.
Thanks, Stephen. So, there's a couple of things that come immediately to mind, again, as a basis. Let's just remember that democracy is expensive. And at local government level, I say there is no place for the shenanigans of state or federal, at federal level, and perhaps even state, the type of shenanigans and wasteful political games that are played. Local government council is more akin to a simple business, and it isn't a place for career politicians to begin. It's not a place for party politics. You want party politics, go to the state as a minimum. Stay out of federal Frankston Council and local government councils, because the business of running these places is more about exactly what we're talking about here. Strict fiduciary concern. Yet that's what we've seen in this council and, of course, throughout the nation, right across every state and territory, is this business of people jumping in thinking that they're some kind of federal politician, when really the mums and dads, grannies and kids in this local area want them to make a local impact directly, such that it hits the ground running, and not some kind of big noting themselves, as Brad's pointed out, to say, well, I'm going to put forward a motion because I haven't spoken for a while and I want more of a media profile. Not the place for it, ladies and gentlemen, go somewhere else. So following in from that, it is very expensive if you start to play politics. Democracy, there's nothing cheaper than an absolute monarchy or a dictatorship. It's very cheap. There is no discussion. There is no expensive bicameral or monocameral situation, unicameral situation. We don't have, in Frankston, it takes integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, those that are on and those that are aspiring, it takes integrity, personal discipline to understand that your ego is the last thing on the list, not the first. That's sort of where I would start this whole discussion. From there, a $30,000, $50,000, $80,000 wire mesh, you might be commenting on exactly how it is that federal overlays of health and safety, the various regulations, building codes go through the state system, and the state then adds their little bits and pieces to add quality, so-called, in building a wire mesh fence, until finally it gets down to a local government council and their internal wasteful approaches to adding yet another layer and saying, we need to inspect that hole filled with concrete, not just once, but let's try twice and go in for a third time while we're at it. So the bottom line is, it is not all that complex to put up a wire mesh fence. Why should it cost $50,000? Because in fact, because it's much more expensive than that, because that's just the direct cost. That's not involving the on costs of all the people that have been pushing paper across one side of the desk to the other. Look, I'm not against technocrats and bureaucrats and staff. I am one. I've worked in government a lot, and I know that you know, there are so many people in Australia that prior to COVID, we had something like 27%, 24%, depending on who you take the numbers from, of households in this country very, very reliant on government income. And now, for the next foreseeable sort of 5 years or more, we're looking at that being in excess of 50% of Australian households totally reliant on government. And if anybody tries to say that Frankston is immune from that, I say, think again. But what are the solutions? The solutions are that Frankston gets out there and starts collaborating rather than opposing, rather than obstructing. They collaborate with the business sector, and particularly the small business sector, and start supporting it, and collaborating with state government agencies and federal government agencies to get projects going and to take a normal business risk in saying, okay, we can get a car park for commuters. Let's put in 4,000 of those, and that actually can be a business proposition because those car parks have a ongoing perpetual return. That's just one example.
And look, Alan, I think that's a point really well made. And if you think about, you know, how these types of, there is a valid place for notices of motion which is addressing issues of community concern, and we obviously, but clearly there has to be a way in which those are addressed in a very different way. I think that the opportunity around COVID-19 recovery has been lost a little bit by the current council because of the ad hoc way in which it's been responded to. And I say that as somebody who has spent the last 15 years working in disaster and crisis management in different places. I suppose what I want to do now is sort of come back a little bit to the question around, you know, if we're to tighten up how it is council works in terms of not just managing the finances, decisions that are made around budgetary decisions and so on. I get a sense there's a real disconnect between what ratepayers know about the budgeting process and consultation and what it is council does in terms of the council staff, and then what the councillors themselves view on this. And it seems to be that there's kind of three areas that are operating not necessarily in alignment with each other, which does kind of bring up this question of participatory budget making and making sure that everyone understands not just how money is spent, but also how it's collected and why it's done in particular ways, so that then as a city, we're sharing in the consequences of the decisions that we make. Brad, I might come to you on that one first.
Look, generally, you know, the budget takes a few months to do to get right. It starts off with the council officers will present to councillors a framework on what they reckon the spending ought to be and what they reckon the income ought to be. And they'll have a list of, you know, projects that they reckon are due. You know, it might be, again, refresh of a playground, spending on the foreshore. It might be X amount for marketing, X amount for economic development, aged care, whatever it is. And then the councillors will take that as the starting point and, you know, they might ask for this item to be taken out and this one to be stuck in, and oh, you know, here's the next 5 years of spending priorities. We'd like to bring something forward. We'd like to put another item back, and then you know, the budget is presented. It's out for public consultation for a month, and then it's voted on. But to be honest with you, the truth is that once it's out to consultation, it's pretty much locked in. They've spent months and months on it, and it's very, very difficult for any of that by consultation to be taken into account. So, you know, if the public is genuinely interested, they need to do their lobbying earlier in the year, and then it becomes a part of the process. Having said all that, the average ratepayer doesn't particularly care too much about the budget. You know, to them, it's a boring document. It's a boring process. What they care about is their rates. You will have a few who are interested in a particular sporting club or a particular, you know, area of spend, but the vast majority, all they know about the budget is their rates bill. And, you know, there are some councillors that lose sight of that. They get too caught up in the process. They get too caught up in particular projects, and they forget that we have a lot of low income earners who struggle with their $3,000 a year.
Alan, I might invite you to give a reflection on that before we move to Peter.
So the process is important, and it's you know, it's a decades, generations long precedent. The process is and has always been. All that really happens is that over time, under poor stewardship, local government councils become burdened with process. So that, for example, a house approval that you know, only 20 years ago might have taken one officer a few hours and perhaps 10 pages of paper, all of that gets blown out to be hundreds of consultants, not literally, but, you know, the need for external consultants, the need for an external consultant as well as an internal employee to go and check whether that PowerPoint is properly connected, and so on. So there is an element of the process that, whilst important and whilst always existing in a Westminster type of system that we have in place, separation of powers and all that sort of thing justifies these processes and natural justice concepts. At the end of the day, we seem to have been very creative at extending and extending the bureaucracy around every one of these processes. Now, whilst large business can afford these regulatory overheads, whether they're within council or external to it, small business just simply can't. And we therefore have a wealth inequality, a distribution which is a concentration of wealth and of activity, and reduces everybody else to being some kind of worker, employee. And of course, we know that for the last 2.5 decades, Australia's household income has actually declined. So what I would say to all that is, how does Frankston Council at a local level take control of itself to then remember that we've got people who matter out there as the majority of the population and who simply cannot be forgotten for internal navel gazing type of activities that result in ever increasing paper shuffling and obstructive bureaucracy when it need not be.
Thanks very much, Alan. Peter, your reflections, and you know, I think the point that that Brad's also made around the you know, budgets can be boring. How do you actually get people engaged, or how do you communicate in a different way so that they actually feel some sense of agency in the decisions being made on their behalf?
Yeah. Okay, so like Alan, I've been around a little while too. I don't turn to the side too much so you can see the grey hair. but been through the times, certainly in the military and in the public service. Had to look at budgets frequently. It's not my forte. I've never entered the field of study, but you've gone off and done the Institute of Company Director sort of courses and everything, because you have to take it very seriously. So I get myself motivated to look through budgets, line item by line item. I think budgets have to be justified, and items in budgets have to be justified. So I don't think it's, I don't know if this happens, but I don't think it's justifiable for a budget to be formulated without good underpinning reasons for expenditure. That's one thing. The other thing is, as I said before, my thing is economy or economics as if people matter. And that's exactly what we've been talking about. People do matter, people struggling. And I also go to what Alan said. I absolutely agree. You need to, remember that thing called quality management once we used to talk about many years ago. I did put in cheekily in a email to all the directors down at the Institute that we soon have to, a lot of ad hoc decisions have been made because they had to be very quickly, and you have to act fast and be reflexive. But you also need to put the quality management lens over the processes and procedures because it's the old question. If there's a process or procedure there and you can ask the question why, and you don't get much of an answer for yourself, or nobody else can give you an answer, then there's an area that needs to be looked at, not to get rid of people or anything like that, but more to refocus attention and effort. So I do think that appears to me a lot of waste, and I think council really has to be responsible and answerable to the public. Now, I'll just bring up a little example, for instance, that I've noticed when we talk about the yacht club, something probably dear to Brad's heart, the yacht club. He's probably looked at it. I noticed in some papers, I mean, there's an indication that of the number of car parking spaces that are required for the yacht club and for it to go ahead, and the restaurant, etc. Now, I've tallied it up to a total of 555, are required, and there's 84 there. So I'm just wondering what's going to happen about that. It'll be an interesting meeting on Monday. I think we should all pay attention to what happens on Monday. There's also, I do wonder how some revenues are going to be raised, and I just highlight that I worry about the future of a little park or vacant area beside the police station there, and probably all I need to say about that, but it'll be an interesting meeting on Monday.
Thank you, Peter. Now, we probably need to move towards wrapping up, but there were the sort of 2 points I wanted to touch on, if I can just get a brief response from each of you. First one is around this question of transparency. And Peter, I know you and I talked about this when we discussed values, ethics, and accountability a week or two ago. Council owns an enterprise called Park, which provides fantastic facilities. The staff there are brilliant. I have to confess, I am a member there as well, though obviously none of us have been there for some time. But it does concern me that from a kind of financial management perspective, all the decisions around council-owned enterprises are made behind closed doors.
Yep.
There's no transparency or visibility around, it's great that council has some enterprises and that can generate positive revenue streams for the council, which can be then reinvested in our community. But it does concern me about lack of transparency there. Alan, your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Stephen. My thoughts are that every council throughout Australia that has come up with problems in relation to money laundering, money disappearing, corruption, Ipswich Council, if anybody wants to look into it, go right ahead. But then you can also go overseas and you can look into the issue of $52 million taken out of a community of people, a council, a local council, by one person, one lady, And the ratepayers in that council, only 16,000 population.
Wow.
How do you get $52 million out of 16,000 population? And this is US dollars. Now, it can happen. And how does it happen? Because of a lack of transparency. So yes, all of us come to our to these matters with our particular prism of professional cynicism, and accountants, auditors, and so on, and fraud investigators like me come at it with that particular lens of being a little bit suspicious when any one of the 4 or 5 key indicators of trouble ahead pop up in front of us. And trouble ahead is about commercial incompetence. Trouble ahead is about local government councils suddenly deciding that they should have a commercial arm. Every problem in every council right across Australia, and including within our own Victorian bunch of 3 that are currently under administration, arises from an approach that is akin, directly or indirectly, to having a commercial arm that operates under commercial incompetence, lack of transparency.
Yeah,
I think
big thing.
the council has an independent entity called Peninsula Leisure, and they run the aquatic centres in Frankston. And I would have to say, I guess, the pros and cons as I see, they actually generate a surplus which they return to council. I don't think there are many aquatic centres across Australia that actually generate a surplus. You're unable to make money heating an Olympic-sized pool and then have your revenue stream consisting of people swimming up and down doing laps. So hats off to Peninsula Leisure for actually operating successfully. I think probably the most popular facility in Frankston is our aquatic centre, and they do it without a cost to the council. The Frankston Arts Centre, on the other hand, which is completely council run, it isn't autonomous, costs ratepayers in the order of $1 million a year in cash injection. What I don't like about Peninsula Leisure is that when they report to council, when they report the minutes of their meetings to the council, they're appearing on the closed council agenda.
Yeah.
Right, so we never know what's happening on the board with Peninsula Leisure. There are some extracts of what's happening there that they publish independently, but we don't actually get to have a look at that document. Now, it's fair enough that from time to time they will have some matters which perhaps relate to individuals or employees or whatever. That can easily be redacted. You don't need to consistently, month in and month out, withhold the entire documents. So it's hard to criticize stuff that's in a closed council agenda. You can question if it ought to be there at all, but I think this is an example where I would suggest they are a little bit too secretive than what they need to be.
Could I just pop in there, because Brad raises a couple of great issues, and what I'd like to say is the debate about around whether or not council should run commercial entities is completely separate to the way that council runs those separate entities. And let's just be clear, the more that government enters into what would otherwise be private sector activity, the more that the market is crowded out.
Yeah.
Now,
look, I got to just butt in there, Alan, because I agree with you. What I was going to say is that sometimes with the operation of these, and I appreciate, Brad, that I think you are part of the creation of, or got that going, that centre going, which it is a great centre. But yeah, picking up on what Alan's saying is that sometimes the way these entities operate comes right back to where did the problem begin. It's at the beginning. when the contract is let, the type of setup is established. I totally agree with Brad, and I think I'm hearing from Alan as well. You shouldn't, I don't know about commercial operations that have so much secrecy. And how was it that they were allowed not to report fully back to the council? Is it in their contract? Well, it shouldn't be. And I know when people, in my experience, have some issue with the centre, they go to council and the council says, no, sorry, wash hands, nothing to do with us. Go and talk to them. Well, it doesn't work. People have discovered who the CEO is of Park. Some friends of mine who, by and large, they think it's a great place, but they've discovered the CEO and the CEO gets emailed directly now by them saying, what's your budget? Can you tell us the basis on what we're paying and what your profit is? So people have gone to those extents. So I think the extent that council allows an operation to not be, accountable fully, by the sound of it, in information at least, back to council, is problematic. Is that what I was hearing, Brad?
Well, no, I think it's they're completely accountable to the council. They report to the council. I've no reason to believe they're withholding anything from the council. It's just that when the council appear to be having all of their reporting into a closed meeting of the council instead of an open meeting of the council.
So the 30%, the 28 to 30% of in-camera sessions.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that's really quite indicative of the problem, is that compared to similar councils, only 8% of decisions, or roughly 8% of decisions, are actually made in closed session, whereas at Frankston, we're almost a third of decisions being made. And how can you have faith in a system that is so lacking in transparency?
Yeah,
and it's no wonder people get frustrated.
Just open up the reporting, redact the document if you really need to, but the entire reporting documents are kept confidential. It's completely opaque. We are going
to have to move to a wrap up. There was one question I wanted to come back to, which was from Frankston Community Notice Board around, if there are significant community issues, do we disregard them by limiting notices of motion? Certainly that's not my view. My view is that there's still a place for notices of motion, but where they've got a budgetary impact, they need to be thought through very, very carefully and in the context of the budget. Does Alan, Brad, or Peter, do you disagree with that view?
No, look, we do need to allow the notices of motion. The problem is when the motion is for a new playground outside the budget process, or whatever it is outside the budget process, it's hard for councillors to oppose it in public like that when on the surface it looks like a worthy cause or a just item. But the average man on the street would think, why are you stopping the citizens from having this or that, right? So the councillors need to be strong about it and not weak-willed.
Often these matters, if I could say, often these matters come back to a philosophical, and I say again, unfortunately, across political party lines type philosophical argument. And that is to say, if we have parks reporting that they're making a profit, the question must be asked, are they reporting on a cash basis or an accrual basis? The question must be asked, were the assets purchased and therefore is there a return on asset calculation, or were the assets originally granted as a consequence of government doing its business? So for example, the current site upon which the water board. Now that land and that site went land value free as a incentive program, and the productivity commissions across the globe and across Australia, across every state and territory, have tried to say to local government councils and state governments alike, please stop your bidding wars.
Yeah, I think
Qantas is currently doing.
Yeah, I think Brad, you probably know a bit about that land transfer. It was a bit of a difficult. I think we all heard something about that this morning. were all there at the meeting.
There's all kinds of stories. Excuse me, Peter. There's all kinds of stories around what happened. The truth around what happened is that the council sold the land to Southeast Water, and the value was according to it the independent state government valuer.
Oh, okay.
That's the truth of the matter. Everyone has a view. There wasn't enough money in this, that, or the other, but that's where the amount came from.
Sorry, I'm just conscious of time, and I've got another meeting after this. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the candidate for West Ward, Oliver Hill, who's made a comment which is along the lines of, the challenge for councillors is that they need to sort of moderate between the desire to spend and the desire of residents and ratepayers to not spend their money, and that's always going to be a balancing act. My view is that people are always happy to pay for things if they see that they're getting value for money and they're getting the right set of services. One last very quick one-sentence reflection from each of you, and then we'll thank our guests for joining us today.
I think the reflection is that any organisation that undertakes internal accounting valuations and internal accounting business transactions is always prone to a valuation problem. What does happen is that sometimes government, local, state and federal need to impact into a market if that market is distorted. If the market isn't distorted, and the situation in Frankston at the time of several of the decisions of these major infrastructure projects that are owned by council or supported by council, at every time there was a market and there was a private sector offer to participate. So I just make a warning that whenever councils are seen to be growing and larger and having more and more influence on the broader market, you have a problem of internal transaction valuations, so-called independent valuations that are not recognised by the market. And Peter's modern monetary theory, I ask people to just do a bit of reading, a bit of Google searching about these sorts of issues, because it's your council that at the end is making these decisions which tend to crowd out the private sector.
Thank you very much, Alan. Brad?
I'll keep it very short. When councillors are making spending decisions in the budget, when they're making decisions on what the rates ought to be, they just need to remember it's not their money, it's the people's money. End of story. And there are people struggling.
Peter?
Yep, exactly the same, virtually what Brad said. It's people's money that's being spent. We have to be careful what's spent on, but a hell of a lot of this has to do with the calibre of who's in council, the decisions that they make, and really working with the council employees as well. Modern monetary theory, as I said, is federal level, but it was a demonstration of how we need to think a little bit outside of the box in recovery with COVID-19. We've also got Piketty. There's others.
Thank you very much,
There's always all of them. Yeah, going on.
I'm going to say thank you to Brad, Alan, and Peter, and thank you for those of you who've been watching and have provided comments and questions. I think what's really clear to me over the course of this campaign is that we do need a fresh start for Frankston, and I look forward to talking to you all again on Sunday for our second Sunday session. There won't be policy, but there'll be good discussion. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys. See you, Alan. Be good to work with you.